Hello and welcome to the Forest is Forest podcast. My name is Nikki Ruck and I'm a podcast producer for Wildwood Arts. On a beautiful frosty morning back in November, I joined Kevin Stannard from Forestry England for a stroll through the woodland near Park End Church to hear about the heritage of the forest and to find out just what's involved with managing all the flora and fauna within the forest today.
I'm Kevin Stannard, I'm the Deputy Surveyor of the Forest of Dean for Forestry England. As Deputy Surveyor of the Forest of Dean, I'm essentially the Senior Officer for the Forestry Commission in the Dean. So I'll set the strategy really for where the Forest of Dean is going and what the Forestry Commission are doing here. The Forest of Dean is a unique forest. It really is a jewel in the crown of the Forestry Commission, and we very much see ourselves as custodians of the forest for the current community and for future generations. The amazing thing about the forest is its depth of history, and what we see around us today is just a snapshot of the forest through time.
How old is the forest then?
How old is the forest? It's like a family really. This is just one generation. You can go back at least to the 13th century when the verdurers were first appointed, but in reality I think you can go back to probably not as far as the Romans. There is evidence that when the Romans were here you would have been hard pushed to see it as a forest, but certainly when the Normans invaded and set up the Royal Hunting Forests and introduced forest law, this was already recognised as a royal holding, probably well wooded, but I suspect actually we've got more trees in the Forest of Dean today than we've ever had.
And what species of trees do you have?
It's known for its oak, but we've pretty much got every native broadleaf here, plus quite a few exotics that we've planted in. We've got a vast range of conifer species that have been planted in since the 18th century. One of the beauties of the forest is that for many years it's been a research centre for silviculture, which is the art and science of growing trees. So you can go back to one of my predecessors, Edward Machin, and when he was first appointed in the 1830s, he set about a whole series of oak planting trials which were well written up and became effectively the textbook of how to grow oak in the British Isles. Quite pertinent that we're stood here by Park End Church because Edward Machin at his time actually paid for the bells in Park End Church when it was first built. Surrounding the church here you've got these magnificent oaks which may well have been some of the early Edward Machin plantings, but then you can look across and you've got oak, conifer trees and larch up on the hill. We talk about climate change and we talk about the impact of climate change. Well, the larch is gradually getting felled out of the Forest of Dean because of Phytophthora morum, and Phytophthora is a fungal disease that has come in the last 10 years, 15 years, gradually killing off all of our larch trees. So that fantastic autumn colour up there, the orange of the larch on the hill catching the morning sunlight, that will all go. But in amongst there you've got young pine crops that are also dying because of Dophystroma, disease of the needles. And again, Dophystroma has been rampant on mainland Europe for many years, but it's really only been in this country for the last 5 to 10 years. And all of the science is telling us is that to have a healthy, thriving forest in the future, we need to maximise tree species. Now, the view we've got in front of us, which is a fantastic autumn view, bright frosty sunny morning. You've got the oaks which have lost their leaves, but behind them you've got the green conifers coming through, the orange of the larch in its autumn colour, and you've actually got a whole spread of intimate mix of trees there which is looking quite wonderful. So getting a mix of species is better for disease, it's better for the beauty of the forest, and it's actually better for productive capacity. Foresters will talk about productive capacity in terms of timber production, but productive capacity in terms of climate change is also about the speed it takes carbon out of the atmosphere and fixes it as wood. And the link between the two, if we can grow quality timber that then goes into house building or furniture, that carbon is then locked up for longer. If it goes into chipboard or paper or firewood, that's a relatively short-lived product and will end up back in the atmosphere again.
And what about when you're planting, are you considering the wildlife in the area as well?
Well, Forestry England's got 3 targets really. We deliver forestry for people, we deliver forestry for wildlife, and we deliver forestry for the economy. So the wildlife aspects are absolutely key. And again, having a diverse species range, diverse habitat mix with well-managed open spaces, quality diverse edge habitat, that is absolutely what wildlife needs. And certainly through our Shared Forest programme and the Foresters Forest programme, our Heritage Lottery funded landscape programme, where we've been working with the Wildlife Trust and many others, we've been looking at getting a permanent network of open space, wetland habitats designed back into the forest, all of which is designed to secure the wildlife we've got, but encourage new species to come in and thrive. One example of that is adders. Adders and reptiles are generally on the decline across the country for numerous reasons, but part of the Foresters Forest programme we've been specifically looking to understand what the distribution of adders are and other reptiles are, and then make sure that we've got well-managed habitat for the benefit of those species going forward. And there are some early successes in that. A gentleman called David Dewsbury, who's leading on that project, has identified reptiles in sites he didn't expect to find them in the forest. It's always fantastic to see something you didn't expect to see, because it shows actually the forest is in good health.
At this point we decided to walk a little further into the forest.
And some rooting from the wild boar there.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah, the wild boar have been through there probably a couple of days ago, looking at how many leaves have fallen on it since.
Because they're not a pest, but they cause a little bit of damage, is that right?
Wild boar are very controversial because they weren't part of a planned release, they were illegally dumped in the forest, so there wasn't a proper analysis before they arrived. You either love them or you hate them, but the truth is in low densities they're good for the forest, because this rooting might be unsightly, but it actually breaks up static ecosystems. So where you've got rank grassland or brambles, the rooting actually disturbs that and allows other plants, flowers to come in, and insect diversity and everything else then improves as a result. The problem we've got is we've got too high a density of boar, so that benefit is lost by the continual rooting of the same place. On top of that, they then push out into the surrounding communities, and so whilst we in the forest don't necessarily mind the rooting of the grasslands, if it's your cricket pitch or your garden, then you do mind.
Besides being a nuisance in people's gardens, the wild boar are also causing chaos on the highways.
Last year 200 wild boar were killed by road traffic accidents, which just puts that into context really, that a relatively low number of boar, 1,800, 1,900, equates to at least 200 road traffic accidents. So that's quite a significant issue. Our target is to bring the number of wild boar down to around 400 or 500 and then maintain them there.
As well as trying to reduce numbers of some of the more controversial forest residents, there are plans to increase some of the more traditional inhabitants.
One of the cultural heritage features of the forest are the free roaming sheep. So we lost about 2,000 during the foot and mouth disease, and only 500-600 sheep have ever come back onto the forest, which means that what we call in the forest waste have all started scrubbing up. So that's impacting a lot of our wildlife like butterflies, etc., that like the open space and the sunny glades. And again, under the Our Shared Forest programme, putting a permanent network of open space back in and then maintaining it will address that. That leads on to the grazing project, which we're working with Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust on, because we have enclosed fairly large areas now for conservation grazing, and the idea of that is to put cattle and ponies onto those sites to get the vegetation knocked back to a stage where in maybe 10 years' time we can take those fences down and maintain those areas by background grazing again. But that does require the number of sheep in the forest to dramatically increase, And just like boar, they're rather controversial,
Right.
mainly because of the loss of the traditional grazing areas. A lot of the sheep now are hanging around the villages, and not so much of a problem this time of year, but in the height of the summer, where you've got high concentrations of sheep hanging around houses, you also get a high concentration of sheep poo, which then starts smelling. But if we can open up the grazing areas back in the forest again, which is the plan, then the shepherds will be able to move the sheep back into the forest and away from the villages.
Do you know how many acres the forest area is within the Forest of Dean?
How big is the Forest of Dean is another difficult question, because it all depends on definitions. We're allowed to enclose up to 10,000 acres in the Forest of Dean. That's a 17th century regulation law that we still abide by. The statutory forest is another boundary that dates back to the 1830s, and indeed the riots back at that time. So you could give an answer anywhere between 10,000 acres and 20,000 acres, depending on your definition of what you mean by the forest.
I was curious to know how many people it took to manage such a large area.
In the forest, there's 2 beat teams, so there's 2 beat foresters, each with a couple of work supervisors and some community rangers, the wildlife rangers, and then we've got a rec team covering the recreation sites. So the short answer to that is we've only got about 20 people actually managing the Forest of Dean. The vast majority of the work is carried out by contractors. There's Park End Church and Edward Machen's bells.
Lovely.
So there's not as many people work for us as you'd imagine given such a large area, but that's because the vast majority of the work is done by contractors these days.
We then took a walk out to one of the many brooks within the forest so that Kevin could talk about Forestry England's water management plans.
The core of the forest sits on the coal measure clays, so other than being an important coal mining area back in its day, the coal measure clays are impervious to water, so we've got a lot of surface water in the forest. The surface water is channeled out by a whole series of brooks, many of which were artificially straightened or lined back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which means when it rains heavily now, water pours out of the forest. The forest does actually act as a giant sponge, so it will soak up quite a lot of water, but after periods of heavy rain, when that sponge is full, it just pours out. There is a high risk of downstream flooding as a result. Now, one of the things that climate change is likely to bring is warmer, wetter weather, and with that wetter weather we can expect more extreme storm events and heavier rainfall. Equally, we can expect more prolonged droughts. So one of the things we're doing under our shared forest is looking at all the water resources, like this brook, and just looking at ways of holding the water up for longer in the core of the forest, so that when it rains heavily, that water isn't just flowing straight down to flood the communities and the villages further downstream, but is being held up, slowed down, and can feed out steadily. The other benefit of that is in periods of drought, if we can hold on to the water in the core of the forest, we can maintain stream levels, and that will encourage the wildlife in the streams, the fish communities, to thrive going forward. Because if we get too dry and the streams all dry up, then that continuity of aquatic wildlife will die off. One of the big schemes is the restoration of a whole mire network either side of Fox's Bridge. As you drive between Speech House and the Dilk Hospital, you'll go through an area that over the next 10-15 years you will see becomes more open and wetter, because we're actively working to recreate the mire there in the heart of the forest. But also when you look at some of these other streams, you increasingly see woody debris, because that's woody debris we're deliberately putting in there to slow the flow.
Okay.
Because they've been running too fast and been artificially straightened, they've eroded down, and so we now need to lift that water again using woody debris to reconnect it with the floodplain on either side. If you go across to Lidbrook in the forest, and just up from there you'll see our enclosed beaver project, and that again is exactly the same principle, except we're using beavers to create the dams rather than us putting the woody debris in. That again is a specific example where Lidbrook Village flooded back in 2013, 2014, and a lot of head scratching about what could be done about it. And after a lot of looking at and costing harder engineering solutions like rebuilding reservoirs and storage ponds, we came across the solution of, well, beavers will do this for us anyway. So we've put the Beaver project in there.
What a brilliant idea. How many beavers did you introduce?
Well, only 2. It's a very large site, 6 hectares, so 2 beavers are in there, and they have this natural inclination to build dams. What they're doing is building up a depth of water, because they then burrow into the banks underneath, and that's their protection from predators. That's their genetic way of living. But they need deep water to do that. So in a forest environment like this, where it's only shallow brooks, they need to build those dams and build them well.
That's fantastic. Obviously they're brilliant engineers.
We've got 2 areas where there are free living beavers. One is down in Devon on the River Otter, and the other's up in Tayside in Scotland. And the hope is that at some point the regulatory framework changes to allow us to have free living beavers again in the Forest of Dean. So one of the things we are starting to do is looking at where we've got plantations coming down to streams and looking to actually diversify the tree species along the stream side, so we can plant in more beaver friendly trees.
I read that you also have introduced pine martens. Why is that?
The main reason why we're reintroducing pine martens into the forest is as a grey squirrel control. Because when you come into the Forest of Dean, one of the things you'll see is a lot of very old beech and oak, and those were planted 100, 150 years ago, and you won't see that many younger 20, 30-year-old beech and oak, because they're all being hammered by the grey squirrels. So the grey squirrels will get in there, strip the bark off, and you'll end up with what we call in forestry terms thicket stage oak and beech, where basically all the leading shoots are all dead. Studies in Scotland and Ireland have shown that where the pine martens are expanding their range, the grey squirrel numbers are going down. And indeed, very excitingly, in Scotland, where the grey squirrel numbers are going down, the red squirrel numbers are coming up. If it's successful, we will reduce the damage to the beech and oak in order to grow those trees on, but also it leads to the exciting possibility of maybe in 10-15 years time that we could reintroduce red squirrels back into the forest, which will be a great conservation success if we can do it.
Planning for the future is an important part of Forestry England's role within the Forest of Dean, but I was interested to find out how closely they are aligned with verdurers' role in the forest.
The verdurers are an important institution in the forest, and Forestry England, Forestry Commission are very supportive of them and very supportive of that tradition. The first verdurers were appointed in the 13th century, and there's been a continuous chain of verdurers ever since. The verdurers' court sits in the Speech House Hotel. So the court normally sits 4 times a year. We haven't sat since February because of COVID. Whilst the verdurers have no legal authority, they do have a very strong moral authority. I attend the verdurers' court, as does the deputy gaveller, and the deputy gaveller looks after everything underneath the ground and I look after everything above the ground. That's the historic split between the deputy surveyor and the deputy gaveller. We go there, we keep the verdurers up to date with what we're doing, we listen to their concerns, and we see them as the cultural bastions of the forest. Under the Forest is Forest programme, we've got such a diverse collective of community-led projects that one of the things we're looking at after the lottery funding runs out is whether the verdurers will be able to lead our Foresters Forest Forum going forward to keep that collective of cultural, natural and built heritage projects together under their stewardship and their care. We are looking at the forest of where it needs to be in 100 years, and it needs the verdurers. It needs that collective of people interested, passionate about the cultural, natural, built heritage of the forest, so that everything we hold dear about the forest today is still there in 100 years' time.
There's a land between 2 rivers where the Severn meets the sea, and the silver wire runs laughing on her journey to be free of the cliffs that hold her close from Cobbett Hill to Beachley Quay. That's the place where I belong, where I long to be. There's a land between two peoples where the morning air's like wine, and the hands that reach in friendship, they're the blue scars of the mine, where the tongues sound rough to strangers' ears, but the words they speak aren't kind. That's the land where I belong, the place for me and mine. There's a land between two nations where the Severn meets the Wine, and 100,000 treetops reach their branches to the sky. You can lie and watch the salmon swim by cliffs where falcons fly. That's the land where I was born, where I wish to die. There's a land between two rivers where the Severn meets the sea, and the silver wire runs laughing on her journey to be free of the cliffs that hold her close from Cobbett Hill to Beachley Quay. That's the land where I belong, where I long to be.
That was Dick Bryce singing The Land Between Two Rivers. You have been listening to the Forest as Forest podcast, brought to you with thanks to the National Lottery Heritage Fund.